Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer LCMFT CST-S. You can find all her core resources at natashahelfer.com. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so care for yourself accordingly. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Autocrate.
Hello, everybody. My name is Natasha Helfer. I am the host of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. And today with me, I have Ellen Bernard, who I know from the website A Woman's Touch, but she is a social worker and she is a certified sexual educator through ASECT. And I'm just so excited to get her to talk, especially on this podcast where we try to really dismantle shame with, education and stories and all kinds of information, which I think is hugely lacking when it comes to comprehensive sexual education, and especially in the arenas we're going to talk about today, which is like disabilities and sexuality and aging. But why don't you, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. I think it's more exciting when people introduce themselves and tell us about their stories. So Ellen, why don't you give us a bit of your history and background?
Yeah. So I always tell the story that I started being a sex educator a long time ago. So 51 years ago, when I first read an excerpt from the very first Our Bodies, Ourselves book. And the topic was women's masturbation. And so this is, 1972. So a long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, even think about that was 51 years ago. And I read it and I was amazed. Nobody had taught me any of this, right? How in the world had I gotten this far? But, of course, we understand why, because we don't like to talk about any of these topics. So I went and tried what they wrote about and had the most amazing experience. And really, it opened my mind to what was possible in realms that I had no knowledge of before that. And so, of course, I had to go start teaching my friends about this miraculous experience that I had. And nobody stopped me and nobody told me I wasn't supposed to. And I tell people that that's how I became a sex educator. And that's how I became a sex educator who did not associate sex with shame, because I didn't learn about sex as a shameful experience. I had this really life-affirming, pleasure-affirming experience with myself, with the reading. It was a very uplifting, I wish I could find the excerpt. I probably could find it in some archive. But it was wonderful and really taught me that this is something that should be shared and talked about. So ever since then, I was the one who was always talking about and teaching my friends, and then teaching my peers and my clients as a social worker all about sex. And I was the one advocating. So I worked with people who were elderly and people who had physical and cognitive disabilities as a social worker. And everywhere I went, I was the one asking the question, what about sex and relationships for this person? Because I was in charge of doing life planning for people. And it was a piece that was always left out. Nobody ever wanted to talk about it. And so I started being the one that was always talking about it in every space. So that was in nursing homes, in institutions, in group homes, in people's own homes. And I was always including sex and relationships in their care plans and in their support plans and then their life plans. And so it was always what I was known for, and it was always my favorite place. So when I decided I needed to stop being a social worker and wanted to open a place in the world that sold products and gave information that affirmed pleasure and healthy sexuality for everybody, it made sense that I made that leap. People always are like, why did you go from social work to running a store? And I'm like, well, because running a store allowed me to do education as a part of something that people were really used to, and that was going shopping.
Yeah.
And so, when we opened the store, I had a business partner who's no longer there, but we talked about doing education through retail and offering people a very familiar environment where we could help them learn about topics they were afraid to talk about anywhere else, and give them an environment that affirmed sex from the person and what they want, and sex as pleasure. And that's what I've been doing for the last 27 years, is talking to people about that every day. Every day I have people come in with questions around, how do I let go of shame? How do I improve what I am experiencing? How do I get what I want when I have changes in my body because of age or disability or illness? How do I work with a partner who has a disability? Or how do I deal with the fact that the world doesn't show my body and my reality? So I have nowhere to turn to learn about sex and pleasure. So that's what I do every day. And that's why I'm here today.
I love it. And your store geographically is in Wisconsin, is that correct?
Madison, Wisconsin. So kind of right in the middle of the country.
And then your website, you started that, I think you said
1997 was,
Mhm.
we were very early on. We had a customer who came in and she said, hey, this thing is going on and I'll build you a website. And so we got online in 97 and have been there ever since, through all kinds of ups and downs, in the internet world, in the economy, everything else,
Yeah,
But
right.
yeah, we've been there ever since. And our website address is not intuitive, because even in 1997, a woman plastic surgeon already had the website, awomans touch.com. So we've never been able to have that. And so, because we call ourselves a Woman's Touch Sexuality Resource Center, and we really want to emphasize the Sexuality Resource Center part of us, our website ended up having the address of sexualityresources.com, so that people could know that that's what we were there for.
Yeah. I mean, I remember even before I became a sex therapist myself, but I was, marriage and family therapist primarily. You were one of the only resources I could find that was trustworthy. and
Right.
and so I don't know, I just have this huge, like, I'm kind of fangirling when I'm talking to you, because I'm like,
Thank
this
you.
is
That's really
yeah,
sweet.
it's like super exciting to be talking to the person who created this resource that I've been like throwing out there forever. So it's really cool.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, another reason why I connected with you is because we both helped Dr. Stephanie Bueller teach at her Bueller Institute for LearnSexTherapy.com, which is where therapists can go to get the educational piece for AASECT accreditation. And so this is where I hear you speak all the time. And so this is what I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about today. And one of the things that you say that really kind of stuck with me from the very first time that you said it, and I'm not sure if it's your quote or if you got it from somewhere else, but you said, we are all temporarily able-bodied. And that really stuck
I
with
learned
me.
that from a person with a disability that I worked with. And I've heard it around in the disability community a lot. Don't know who first said it, but I don't claim credit for it. But I do claim credit for really helping us process the idea that we are all temporarily able-bodied, because I think it helps us understand why we need to understand what you and I are talking about today.
Yeah, well, and especially because, as you were saying, and we talk about this a lot during our classes, is that when people are ill or when people have a disability, we tend to asexualize them or desexualize them. It's now, there must be something, that gets in the way of you being able to be a healthy, quote, healthy sexual being. And yet at the same time, we all know that we're sexual from birth to death, in some way or another. Even if you identify as asexual or gray sexual, those are still things that are with you, throughout your life. And so this can be very diminishing for people to be treated by their peers, by doctors, by mental health professionals, by their family, as basically desexualized beings.
Yeah, yeah. It's an odd thing that even like somebody who has a spinal cord injury, they tell me the story that they went through rehabilitation and they address all these activities of daily living except for sex. And it's as if all of a sudden the rehabilitation community says, well, when you got injured, your sexuality went away, that it no longer exists, that we don't have to address it. that you will no longer think about it, want it, or be interested in it. And yet we know from all kinds of people that are out in the world being very sexual that of course not. It may change, and it may require a lot of learning and adaptation. But that's not erasure. That's just learning and adaptation. And it's as if, well, my theory is we're afraid to dive into what it would take to actually teach people new skills and new ways to think about approaching intimacy and sexuality after chronic illness, after injury, if they're living with a disability, even people who are living with cancer. But cancer professionals, for the most part, although it's changing, for the most part, they skirt that topic, even though sexuality is deeply affected by cancer diagnosis and treatment. And so, there we are, and people are left to figure it out on our own or not. And we do a big disservice to folks because, again, as you point out, even if you identify as asexual or gray sexual, there's still a relationship to sexuality, right? It's still somewhere in our identity. And then also, it's one of the major ways, when I talk to students a lot, I talk to college students a lot. And one of the things I ask them is, why do people have sex? And one of the first answers, fortunately, they don't answer making babies anymore, which is great, because I do this most often at a Catholic college.
Okay.
But they say to connect with somebody else, to connect intimately. And if we say, well, that part of you is no longer present, then how is it that we expect people to connect intimately? And how is it that we think that suddenly their partner will no longer want to connect intimately on a sexual level? And if we don't give both of them, all of them, the tools to try to figure out things like how to adapt, then we're doing a huge disservice to all of those relationships and all of those desires that have not gone away. They just sit there and sometimes lead to frustration or confusion. And as professionals, it's our job then to deal with that, right? If you have somebody who comes in who's acquired a disability or who's living with a chronic illness that has now resulted in serious changes in their sexual function, you need to have the skills and the resources to be able to talk with them and address that and help them find their path, right? Which is why I love doing the education I do with Stephanie through the Institute, is that it is designed to give therapists those tools, that knowledge, the understanding that it doesn't go away, but it changes, and we do change. I'll give a really good example. I have a partner with a chronic disability, and recently they had a knee replacement. And as we've been navigating, yes, of course, everything changed for a while because pain takes away the interest for a bit. But as we've been navigating their recovery and our reconnecting and learning, we've had to relearn all the things that are possible now that we have a new knee. And it involves a lot. It involves, let's figure out different positions, let's figure out different supports, let's figure out how we can keep the energy going in a way that doesn't get affected by pain or lower energy, lower stamina, right? This is somebody who's recovering. They're older. They're recovering from a pretty big surgery. And so we've had to have lots of conversations and do a lot of planning. That requires a lot of skill. That requires comfort in talking about, this is what feels good right now. This is what I need. This is what I want. This isn't working for me right now. Oh, that didn't feel very good. Let's shift. And it requires, on my part, it requires the ability to be adapting with them, right? And to say, oh, that hurt, and not shut down and say, oh, forget it, let's just stop, right? Which is what a lot of couples do. Gets hard, we stop. Instead, say, okay, let's regroup. Let's talk for a moment. Let's figure out what's needed. where it's needed, how we can make this keep going. So it requires communication. It requires the skill of adapting in the moment. It requires the skill of adapting in a bigger picture way. So like we literally, yesterday we had a probably half an hour conversation to set things up for us so that we didn't run into any challenges. Well, any unusual challenges. I think being sexual with two people is always interesting and challenging, and things change in the minute. But it was so good to have it all figured out, to say pillows here, this there, this there, this is what I need. Let's have everything available so that we can make this be the experience we want it to be for each of us and for both of us. Lots of skills that I've honed over the years and that we all need to learn when anything changes that affects our sexuality.
Yeah, you're talking about so many things that I want to dig a little bit deeper on. I mean, like on the one hand, we just talked about how it's offensive when people are treated like they're no longer sexual because they're dealing with a disability or an illness or just aging. On the other hand, like you're saying, energy is, you know, dwindling as we get older. Sometimes we are in chronic pain. And so I hear sometimes the other side of that argument, which is, why is my partner still expecting me to be sexual when I am, handling all of this stress? Or there's even this kind of like idea, I think, again, we're seeing this less and less, but now I'm older. I don't need to have sex anymore. I don't have to have sex with you anymore. And especially if you're the lower libido partner, maybe you're looking forward to not having to have sex anymore because, quote unquote, I'm old now. So
Right.
these are all these kind of cultural norms, I think, that we've had around aging, sickness. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit too, like when you're on the side of thinking, maybe I don't want to be asexual, and what might be some, I mean, sometimes it's okay to just accept that and just say, yeah, maybe that part of my life is no longer going to be what it is. But at the same time, there are a lot of benefits to staying sexual, and I wouldn't want cultural norms to be the reason why you make that decision.
Well, and the other thing I talk with people about a lot is a lot of folks, so they lose a partner, maybe they're widowed, and so they say, oh, that's fine. I'll just let go of this part of me. I'm never going to, this is the end of it for my life. And yet, the reason they often come in to see me is 5 years or 10 years later, they've met somebody who sparks that interest. They start dating and they realize that because they haven't maintained their connection to their sexual self and maintained their body parts and the body parts' ability to function sexually, they can't have the sex that they want. And so when they want it, it's not possible. So that brings a couple of things up. One is it's absolutely fine if you're in a relationship and you both agree we're just going to let that go, or we're going to manage it in a way that maybe is less active or less often. That's okay. However, understand that our sexual systems, our body systems need nurturing. They need to keep being used to function well. And because we change as we get older, we need to get to know how we change over time and add adaptive skills like adding lubricants or positions or different time of day to address the lack of energy, right? So one of the things that my partner and I have adapted to is, we used to be, before sleep was our favorite time to be sexual. Not an option because they're asleep really fast and way before I am. And so we negotiated and navigated our schedules so that we could have it during the day on days when we were both present, when we both had energy and could stay awake. And that's something that people can do rather than just giving up, right? You can just say, oh, well, let's shift when, and, let's make sure that we keep a block of time available so that, and then we also have to talk about, and we can shift how. What does it look like? It doesn't have to look like it did when we were in our 20s and 30s, but skin on skin and touch and that very close intimacy is important to us. It improves our health in a lot of ways. It keeps our relationships strong because of the hormones that get secreted when we do that. And it gives us this very special time with our partner that allows us to do something that we can't do in public and that we can't do with anybody else. And all of those are really special and precious and important to our mental health and physical health. So I think accepting that sex goes away is really is a horrible message. And I agree with you. I think it's finally changing, mostly because the baby boomers in particular are saying that's just not how I am. It's not who I am. It's not what I want. And when we decouple sex from procreation, that also helps, right? Because if it's not about making babies, then after the point when we are no longer able to make babies, what is it about and what is it for? And how do we think about it? And how do we then talk to each other about it and say, well, I think I want something really slow and warm and touchy instead of hot and explosive. And all of that's fine. And hot and explosive is fine too. We just need to talk about it. And we need to say, what are you in the mood for? How do we craft together? Or how do we craft for ourselves? So a lot of the folks who come in who are widows or widowers, I say to them, while you may not have a partner now, you need to maintain your sexual system. You need to keep your sexual health functioning because nerves need to be practiced or they stop working as well. Blood flow has to keep happening into our body parts to keep that possible for when we do decide to either enjoy pleasure ourselves or with somebody else or both. And so we have to practice and we have to nurture that part of ourselves. And it's hard because people say to me, I didn't know I had to work at this. And I say, well, just like we have to work at the rest of our health, we have to work at this part of our health.
Yeah.
And in order to, if you love to, let's say you love to play tennis, you have to maintain your body in a way that would allow you to play tennis way late in life, right? If you love to have intimate contact with yourself or somebody else that feels really good and is nurturing and delightful, we need to practice it. We need to nurture that capacity. We need to learn how to adapt it over time and add tools, add things that help us so that we can have what we want in the same way that we might need to put that knee brace on when we want to play tennis as an older person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you're getting at, which is a lot of what I hear from clients, is this grief or this expectation that sex is supposed to be organic and spontaneous and just happen, and I usually try to, I usually have my retort that's like, well, the only thing I know that's happening organically is whatever's happening in my compost pile. So it's
I like that.
I mean, that's kind of what's happening if you just let things sit, right?
Right.
And we don't really do this in any other area of our lives, right? Like if I want to go hiking, I probably have to go to the gym. I just can't go hiking once a month and think I'm going to be like okay to do that if I don't go and figure out my leg muscles or something. And we don't
you have to plan your hike, right? You have to plan it so that you know where you're going and how far, and is it within your capacity, and how do you make that hike wonderful and fun, not just, oh, I've gotten 4 miles, now I have to go 4 miles back and I don't have the energy for it.
Right. And even the tools, like, do I have my water bottle? Do I have my, whatever. So we don't do this with any other area of life. And I think this itself, this idea interferes with people's capacity for pleasure. I get a lot of resistance sometimes from couples about planning, sexuality. Oh, that will create too much pressure, or that's not fun. You're taking the fun out of it. And so I think what you're getting at is that if we want things, we have to get into this mode of flexibility and creativity. Do you want to talk a little bit more
planning
about that?
I want to also say, I think part of the problem we face actually is we have media all around us that shows sex as effortless, easy, spontaneous, and orgasmic all the time without any work. And so part of it is we have to back away from those sources of media, whether that's romance novels or movies or stories, or even some parts of things on TikTok and Instagram. And we have to move toward I can create the richness of pleasure for myself, for my relationship, with intention and planning, right? We do not, like, if you were giving a dinner party, would you just go into your refrigerator the day of and say, oh, well, let's see what we've got here, and I'll just cook from whatever's in my fridge, and be spontaneous about, oh, well, let's see, I've got butter, and I've got some bread, and I got some apples, and what am I going to, right? That's your dinner party? You don't do that. You plan your dinner party. You plan it for maximum delight. And there's nothing wrong with planning sex for maximum delight and being creative about it, right? Reading things, going to a store or a website to learn about, well, okay, I know I need some help here, or I know that things aren't working right this way. So what kinds of things might be available to help me get what I want out of that part of my intimate life? Or what do I do about the fact that I have all these bed pillows that keep slipping out from under me, and I need something to keep my hips up because I've got hip issues and all these things? And, do you stop, or do you say, oh, maybe I'll find something that's more directly crafted to support this activity and to help me get the comfort from my interaction and the comfort from the play? Again, most of our play, although, sometimes play is spontaneous, but a lot of our play, like playing games or doing sports or doing other activities with other people, requires planning and coordination and communication and an idea of what you want to get out of it, and timing, right? You have to schedule it. If I want to play, unless I have a group of people that I know show up in the same place every day, which sometimes happens, but for most of us, if we want to get a group of people together to play together, so we want to have a board game night, we don't just say, oh, well, I'm just going to call 20 minutes early and see who's available, because we'll be disappointed. Instead, we say, oh, okay, I'm going to get everybody, ask about their calendars, get it on the calendar, plan it, say, what do you want to do? What do you want, what do you want to eat? What do you want to play? What do you want to do? All those things we're super comfortable doing because we're used to it, we're taught how to do it, and it's a norm. We don't do the same for planning intimate contact and play because, of course, we grow up with this basket full of messages that you don't think about it, you don't plan it, you don't actually, if you think about and plan sex, there's something wrong with you, that's shameful, that's inappropriate. You shouldn't want to have sex in that looking ahead way. You should be able to be present and available if somebody initiates it, or you should be the one who says, yes, I'm going to initiate this with somebody else, and it should rise spontaneously and immediately. And why we think that, right? Why this kind of play is the only kind of play we don't plan, and is the only kind of play that we don't actually say, oh, well, if we have some markers and some colored paper and some, I don't know, I want to get the glitter glue out and make it really exciting and fun and beautiful, right? That's what we do for craft projects. But we don't do that for the craft and the art of sex and intimacy.
Right. Yeah, and it's really unfortunate, and kind of like when you started earlier talking about conversations, like, and you even mentioned it'd be easy if your partner says ouch or oh that hurts, to just say okay, never mind, and then we just kind of turn our backs to each other and go to sleep or something. It's a very common scenario. And instead of getting creative or asking questions or pausing, what are some of the things you think gets in the way of those conversations? I mean, you've kind of alluded to things like we're not taught, we have these cultural norms about what sex is supposed to look like, where nobody's really talking, it just happens magically.
Yeah, I think about sex scenes in the movies and I think, oh yeah, we didn't talk about birth control, we didn't talk about safer sex, we didn't talk about, do you like this, do you like that, what do you need, what does it take? We just see this like completely seamless, ecstatic experience unfold. And while that can happen occasionally, usually when it's, filled with sparky new relationship energy with somebody new to us, most of the time it just doesn't work. I think it really comes from, the scenario you talk about, where if your partner says, ouch, or says, I would prefer it if you didn't do that way. I'd rather have you do this. We get embarrassed. We're supposed to know what to do. We're not supposed to have to be taught. We're supposed to just know. And quite honestly, people who are raised as men in this culture are taught that they're supposed to know what women want and how to pleasure them. And women are taught that that's supposed to happen. So that's one of the heterosexual norms that we see playing out very poorly with people.
Mm-hmm.
And even, when I work with same-sex couples, women and women in particular, they think that they're supposed to know what their partner likes because they should know what they like. But our bodies are all different. And so we're ashamed that we don't know what we're supposed to know. And when we're ashamed, what do? We shut down. We turn away. We say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. And then we start the self-recrimination talk inside of us. Oh, I didn't, I'm a bad person because I made this happen this way, or I caused pain, or I didn't know what to do, and so I'm a bad lover. Or we allow ourselves to do that. That negative self-talk is so much more automatic around sex than the ability to ask, what is it that you like? What would you feel like? What do you feel like today? What would be really good for you today? Does this feel good? How about that? Did you like that? What would you like me to do differently? Right? Those are all the questions you want to teach people to ask. And when you practice it, like I just said it, it's not so hard. Right? You can say that. I can say that to my lamp and practice it. My lamp doesn't say anything bad, which is good, but it also doesn't give me feedback. But that's the first step, right? The first step is getting it out of your mouth. And then the second step is then doing it with a live person who says, oh, thank you for asking. That's awesome. Let's, right? You want to build some success. That's how we teach it. And then we really want to practice it with great success. That's how we teach a new skill. Do we ever do that with around sex and sexuality? I mean, we don't even teach people to get to know their own bodies, much less somebody else's. Communicating about things successfully starts with ourselves and knowing ourselves, right? I was really lucky that my first sexual experience was all pleasure and was with myself. So I didn't have any negative expectations or negative self-talk that could result. I discovered sex as pleasure and I discovered my body, what it liked, way before I had to deal with anybody else's expectations. Because I never got equipped to deal with anybody else's expectations. And when I became sexual with other people, it was challenging, but I also grew up in the Unitarian Church where we actually got pretty good education. And so I had partners, and that's where I found my first partners. And so I had partners where we would go, remember what we learned about in that that class? Let's try that. And we could do that. So we had a frame of reference that we both understood. And we don't grow up with any of that either. We don't grow up with this, it would be wonderful if we had the driver's ed equivalent of sex, right? Where we all learned rules of the road, the rules of engagement, the rules of asking and exchanging and paying attention and keying into the person and asking over and over again, how's this? How did that go for you? What did you like? What was hard for you? What should I do differently? And wouldn't it be great if we were raised and if we raised everybody? And that allows, going back to the topic of disabilities, change. If we learn those skills to say, what would feel good to you today? You have pain? Where should I stay away from? How much intensity do you feel like today? Do you want to aim for orgasm, or do you just want to make this to be super sweet connection and skin time, right? If we learn how to ask those questions and have those exchanges, then we are able to navigate change, we're able to navigate disability, we're able to navigate aging, we're able to navigate just the changes in everyday function that sometimes make us more present or less present to our ability to key into our erotic self.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about your upbringing. My upbringing was quite different. I grew up in the Mormon culture, and so this idea that I would be able to touch myself or figure myself out was very discouraged, seen as sinful behavior. And I think a lot of people grow up in strict or conservative or even fundamental religions where that's the case, which I think, yes, then you're less prepared. There's a lot more expectations, like you're saying, especially in that heterosexual kind of normative way, that the man will awaken the woman. And really, you've got two young people usually getting married who don't know much about anything in
Right.
regards to sexuality, and that, I think that does lead to embarrassment and shame, that there's something wrong with me. I talk about the fragility of our sexual egos a lot with my clients, and I'm like, and that's okay. I think we're all in that same boat. It doesn't mean that there's something like particularly wrong with you, that you have a fragile sexual ego. Even having somebody like take your hand and guide it differently than maybe what they're currently doing as far as pressure or the rhythm, can feel like, oh no, now you're chastising me.
Mhm.
You're instead of like, oh wow, you're guiding me.
Yeah. And, if we approach our partnerships as partnerships, and I teach this a lot with older folks, especially, as our bodies change, right? All kinds of things that we need and want and like change. And we have two choices. We can be partners, so we work together in the exchange and teach each other, or we can shut it down because it's not working the way we expected or the way it used to. And we are afraid of being judged, afraid of being seen as lacking, wanting. And so what I actually see is either people shut it down or they try to replicate the sex of their youth in ways that their partner may not even want. But they're so afraid to ask, what do you want? That they make assumptions instead. And that whole shift of moving from doing to and doing for to doing with is a huge shift that we have to teach. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that we have to learn that. It's really hard. It's really hard to say. I mean, I have couples that have been together 30 years and they come in and they realize after we have a conversation that neither of them really knew what the other truly loved,
Mm.
even after 30 years. I had a couple like that last week. It was so fun. We all had such a good time because they were ready to break all the norms because nothing was working the way they wanted it to. That we got to go all the way back to day one, to starting and say, so what works for you? What do you get out of sex? What do you want to get out of sex? And they started from there and we walked through and I just facilitated this planning process for them of the kinds of things they wanted to introduce, the kinds of things they wanted to explore. What did they want to bring in, including, things like a vibrator, which she really needed. She'd had a lot of changes in her body. She has diabetes, and so she doesn't feel sensation nearly as profoundly as she used to. And she really needs a vibrator in order to reach orgasm. And she was afraid to bring it up because she didn't want him to think that he wasn't good enough for her.
Mm.
And so instead, she would secretly use her vibrator occasionally. And then all of the other times, she just let it go and didn't get what she wanted when they were together. And he was so excited to know what she liked and wanted.
Yeah.
Um, but it is also true that partners can also feel judged, right? And feel like, oh, I'm embarrassed that I didn't know this, or I'm not enough. And
Yeah.
as soon as somebody starts feeling I'm not enough, I like to say, you're not responsible. You are enough. And as long as you meet in the middle and you both work together, you're both enough. And then you figure out how to be more.
Yeah.
You bring enough to the table and then you add to it to be more and and more full and more fully exciting and delightful.
Yeah. No, that's a lovely story, and I think that's so common. This idea that we keep secrets, one, to protect the other person, right? Because we're afraid we're going to hurt their feelings. So,
Mm.
like, even faking an orgasm to me is a type of secret, right? You're
Yes.
not honest. but you're trying to help that person feel better about their lover status, I guess.
Yeah. Their
Or
skills.
the other reason might be is that I don't want you to be upset with me, right? So I don't want you to feel, if I say I want a sex toy, oh, now you're going to be upset with me because you don't think I'm enough. Or if I tell you a fantasy, now you're going to be upset that I'm not just thinking about you, or things of that nature. So secrets abound a lot. I know, yeah, I know that in your work with the Bueller Institute, one of the things that you're so good at talking about, I think when people think sex, they immediately go to penises and vaginas, right? It's like we don't even think about vulvas, really. We think about penises and vaginas,
Right.
and so it's very intercourse focused. And those, I mean, they are two erogenous parts of our bodies. They are, the penis and the vagina can be erogenous zones, but boy, are we missing out on erogenous potential, right?
Yeah.
Where we don't
Yeah.
include the whole body, and especially with some disabilities and some illnesses, those parts of our bodies don't work or don't work as well. Or so, yeah, can you talk a little bit about just kind of getting creative with our body parts?
Yeah. So one of the first things I like to teach, because this is something people do not learn very much, is that when penises are no longer able to get erect, that doesn't mean that the penis owner can't have an orgasm. That you can absolutely stimulate penises all the way to orgasm without ever having an erection, without ever having penetration. That hands and mouths and toys exist and can be used as the tools to facilitate great pleasure, even without ever having an erection. So that's one of the first things I always like to share with people, partly because a lot of what I talk to people about is, I have a lot of folks who have penises who are just struggling and just want the best answer for getting an erection again. Even when their partner's not all that interested in penetration, they still, it's a big deal. And they think they need it because that's how they have pleasure. I also like to talk to people about the fact that sometimes when your genitals don't have as much sensation anymore, the rest of your body can compensate for that by becoming more sensitive. So the example that I use often when I'm talking about physical disabilities is when somebody has a spinal cord injury, even, either waist down or neck down, lack of sensation, many times other parts of their body become much more sensitive and can trigger an orgasmic like experience with stimulation. Um, I have talked to many people who say, oh, if you nibble on my neck long enough, I'm going to have incredible, excited climax of a certain sort. It's different, but it's still really delightful and big. Or my earlobes, or, even, something I talked about last time was if somebody doesn't have sensation somewhere, you can use visual input to increase the arousal and eroticism of an experience. So if somebody can't necessarily feel their breasts anymore, but their partner loves that part of them, they could sit in front of a mirror and both of them watch the stimulation and get a feedback loop of excitement from the visual of that and the memory of what it felt like before. We can use our minds. Our minds are our greatest tool, but then we can also use our hands and our mouths and a mirror and all kinds of other things to create experiences that could be mind-blowing in pleasure with the pleasure. And the hard part is, right, sitting in front of a mirror with somebody is really hard for us, right? Looking at ourselves, looking at us. That's something we're not taught to do. It can be something that we find very shameful. It's also something because we're not always comfortable with our bodies that we struggle with. So there's a lot of barriers to work through. But the gain from working through all of that could be amazing. And over again, when I ask people, I sat down with a woman last week and it was very clear that what we needed to do was we needed to help her discover her fears and her shame and find a way through them. They kept stopping her and she wasn't having pleasurable sex. And it was getting in the way of her relationship with her husband. And so And every time we talked about it, we came up to the things that embarrassed her or that she was afraid of, but she won. And so the path that she developed for herself, because that's what I do. I don't do therapy around anything. I don't do therapy. I just support people in designing their path and identifying, what are you going to do when that feeling happens? How are you going to navigate through it instead of letting it stop you? How are you going to say, I'm going to do this, even though it scares the heck out of me? How are you going to say, every time my partner and I have sex, I'm going to do one thing that makes me uncomfortable because I need to challenge myself so I can get through these fears. And so that's one of the skills that will get you all kinds of places and allow you to discover what else might work for you, what fantasies might be fun, what scenarios might be fun. Do you want to do some role play? Do you want to meet in a public place and pick each other up and pretend you're strangers because it is a fantasy of yours, right? Those are the things that when you finally acknowledge the ways that you stop yourself with fear and shame, those become accessible when you say, I'm not going to let that happen anymore. I'm going to push into it. I'm going to push through it. I'm going to invite it. I'm going to be okay with fear, and I'm still going to do it. Those are all skills that we can absolutely decide to nurture.
Yeah, you're talking a lot about giving ourselves permission. You're talking about practicing, and I love your thoughts about you're having to push into discomfort, because again, that's not something we usually think about with sex, right? With sex, it's like, oh, I should love everything that I'm doing. I should be excited about everything I'm doing. But anytime you're doing something new or challenging a paradigm, it is going to be a little bit uncomfortable. And that's okay, as long as it's not like trauma type uncomfortable.
Right. Well, I teach yoga and I teach people, I want you to, some of these poses are going to produce discomfort. Discomfort is growth. If it hurts, back off, because pain is what leads to trauma. But if it's just uncomfortable, explore that. Let yourself move into it. Decide what it is you're learning in that moment and push into it just a little discomfort to help your brain grow. We develop new neurons when we challenge our brains to do things that they normally don't, that we normally don't take on. And that means pushing into discomfort, doing something that's absolutely new, doing something that we never imagined. But when we think about it, you get a little excitement, you get a little, woo, and then you get fear. And that woo and then fear means that's a place to push into, right? Because if that's like, ooh, that would be so fun. Oh, I can't do that. That's your spot. That's your information that says, oh, why not? You could do that.
Yeah.
It's going to be, it's challenging. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
But, it'd be so much fun.
Yes.
If I just let myself, if I could just, that's such a exciting idea. And I encourage people to think about that and to move into that piece of it. If there's anything that makes you go, I could never, with a glint of, but it would be awesome if I did, that's where you want to go.
Yeah.
And that's what you want to push into and through.
I love that. I love that. You talked a little bit about body image, even those who are, quite able-bodied and even meet the norms, as far as what we decide is culturally sexy, trend to struggle with body image. I find very few people that struggle with this. You add, a new disability that maybe you haven't had before, or maybe you've had it chronically, but you understand, that people maybe don't see it as attractive, whether you're in a wheelchair, you have a limp, you now have a colostomy bag, you now have a hearing aid, so many things, right? Mastectomy, you have, maybe you're an amputee, maybe you're a veteran. And these things can really affect, how we feel about ourselves and how other people perceive us and whether or not we can present as sexy. I remember just watching, oh my gosh, what was the movie with Tom Hanks? And he had gone to the war and his friend was in a wheelchair. I forget now, the Running movie. I can't believe I can't remember this movie.
Sorry.
Anyway, so, but that was one of the first times I saw in media where there was a wheelchair bound person who was in a relationship, with a wife, right? And And now we have sex education, who also has, a person in a wheelchair who is having sexual experiences, as an emerging adult. But typically these are things that people feel like, oh, now I don't get to be sexy. The world doesn't see me as a sexy individual.
Well, again, one of the problems is we define what is sexy by what the media presents as what we think should be sexy and how we should look and how we should aspire to look. I think that's changing. I think there's a lot of work happening in younger people to talk about the other ways that we are sexy that aren't always about the visual and about the physical. So we've got terms like sapiosexual, which is somebody who finds intellect sexy and who is first attracted to the intellect or the person or the spirit or the spark that's in the person. And then we also have people who are working very hard to broaden out what visual sexiness looks like and what it can be and how it can present by attitude and spirit and not necessarily specific shapes and sizes of body parts or body composition. And so when I work with people who have long-term partners and who have a change that happens, one of the things I do is I ask them to ask each other, what do you find sexy about me? Because invariably what they hear is it's the sparkle in your eye, or it's the jauntiness in your walk when you're feeling really good, or it's your sense of humor, or it's, my partner tells me, oh, I want to lick your brain when I'm particularly intellectually competent.
I love it.
I know. It's just such a funny image, but it's really, that's how they feel. They like really love intellect. That's what they find most attractive. And so finding that out and asking each other so that you're not making assumptions, so that and then also deciding what you think is sexy about yourself and fitting those pieces and shifting them as you need to. So if your body does not represent what you traditionally think is a sexy body, what else about you is sexy? And, is it your ability to have a dirty conversation with somebody else, or to come up with words and sext with somebody? Or is it just your silly, sassy self that you bring to bed that is so much fun because it brings so much energy to the exchange? All of those things, we can control all of that. We can also control how we think about ourselves by recognizing that nobody looks like the mainstream ideal, not even the people that we see. They are sculpted and photoshopped and filtered, and nobody looks the way we think we're supposed to look, really.
Right.
And giving ourselves, again, permission, right? Permission is the root of it all, to feel and be sexy as we are, as we look, as we express, as we communicate, as we feel.
I love it. So we're getting to the end of our time together. I'd like for you to just pick, I don't know, you're just so brilliant and I want to make sure we end too with kind of you giving your resources, because I know you offer consultations for people with lots of these issues. But like I've heard you talk about like, oh, if you've got arthritis, it's hard to turn on a sex toy. What maybe can you give like 2 or 3 just kind of utilitarian practical ideas for 3 different issues that are typical that people come to you with, that you can say, okay, if you're having problems turning on a sex toy, here's an idea.
Okay.
Am I putting you on the spot?
Well, that's a lot to ask. Let's start with the most straightforward, which is if things are too dry, right? Lubricant is the answer for a lot of challenges, right? We experience dryness of vulvas and vaginas, but we also experience dryness of skin everywhere. And so if you have that experience, looking for a really good quality lubricant that both you and your partner like, they like how it feels, you like how it feels, you like how it smells and tastes and whatever, that's going to be the most effective tool for all kinds of things. And if you're dating and you need to be using condoms, and yes, if you're older, you still need to use condoms unless you're both completely comfortable with the STI status of each other, because older folks are unfortunately getting STIs at a rather high rate. Then we want to make sure you absolutely have lubricant, because you want to make sure that condom doesn't break and that everything is comfortable and feels good. So lubricant's always going to be number one on my list.
And you have an article, I think, right, on your website.
Yes, we have. So on our website, we have a lot of resources. There's an educational brochure resource, and each of the brochures is downloadable. So you can download it and read it. You can print it if you have access to a printer. And we have information on how do you choose a personal lubricant for different situations as well as different functions. So that we have. I think the other thing, so if you have arthritis, what you want to do and you want to use a vibrator, you definitely want to look for vibrators that either can be controlled by a phone app or a remote control, or that are just really straightforward and simple, that have easy to push buttons, easy to hold on to. There are a couple of lines of vibrators that have little finger loops that you can slip your fingers through so you can hold on to it without gripping. And they also happen to feature pretty nice light touch buttons. So if your hands struggle with that. Same thing with pumps for penises, for erections. There are pumps that if you have a lot of trouble with grip strength or arthritis, they're powered. And so you just press a button and they work, and you press a button to release it. So looking for things that are powered and supported, preferably either getting help from somebody directly or going into a shop if you can, to pick things up and turn them on so you can see how they operate and how easy or how difficult they are. Because choosing something from online without being able to know how hard it is to turn on or how hard it is to hold is really challenging. And most of the time, those things aren't returnable. So you don't want to put yourself in that position. And I think the third thing that I always talk to people about is use positioning aids, use bolsters, cushions, or different parts of the house, and also use different positions, so that if the positions you normally used to use for having sex together are uncomfortable because of knees and hips or anything else, be creative about using different positions. And I wanted to piggyback just briefly. Also, let yourself grieve for the things that you have to let go of.
Mm-hmm.
Give yourself permission to grieve. Let it go. Allow yourself to move fully toward new things with excitement and curiosity, instead of holding on to, I really wish it was the way it was,
Right.
so that you can really be present to the joy and the pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, it is hard. It is hard to age. It is hard to, lose functions that we used to be able to take for granted. It is
Yeah.
hard to deal with chronic illness, so grief is a big part of it, as is acceptance, right? And I mean, if life is anything, it's all about grief, acceptance, and joy, somewhere in between. I mean, that's
Yep, absolutely. We'll put adaptation in there too, so that we understand that it's still going to take work.
yeah, right. All right. So how can people reach you? What kind of services do you provide? Like help, give you
Yeah,
give us a little bit.
so reaching me through the website is the best. We have a contact us link, and the website is sexualityresources.com. Get resources because there's a sex therapist who has the website address without the S at the end. So
Mm,
sexualityresources.com. And what I do all kinds of things. So most of the time I do brief problem solving with people for free. So they can reach out through the website or they can call. Sometimes you can catch me on the phone. And I help them do just brief problem solving and help them find the resources either online or in the store to address the most common and straightforward problems. We also have a link for buying consultation time with me, and I charge $25 for a quarter hour, and that's for people who, like the person I needed to help work with around shame and fear, so they have more complicated situations that require more dedicated one-on-one for 30 minutes or an hour. You can purchase consultation time and schedule it with me, and you get me full on focused either on the phone or Zoom or in person, so that we can come up with a plan, so that you can come up with a plan with my support to get more of what you want or to address the challenges that you're facing. So all of that's available. And then there's all the educational resources on my website that are topical and address all kinds of our most commonly asked questions and concerns.
Okay, wonderful. And I really encourage listeners to check this website out and definitely take advantage of Ellen's amazing brain and time and energy, because she's I've heard you talk through a lot of different issues that I'm like, wow, I don't know that I would have ever thought of that. So I think it's great.
It's a lot of different brains, I think that's the joy, is putting all of us together and coming up with so many answers.
Yeah, well, you're a huge resource to any of us in the community that are interested in sexuality. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you being on. And I hope people will find a lot of what you've said super useful, because I know I always do. So thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon halls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the home